I just want to cover a little bit of the context of Holland's survey, how it came about, and how it fit into events at the time. And something that we often don't pay much attention to in Canada is that the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War that ended up with Britain taking control of France's former empire in North America, was a smaller component of a much bigger war. It's a war that some historians, Winston Churchill actually called the 7 Years' War in reality the First World War, because it involved all of the great powers of Europe, and it was fought on pretty well every continent that had people on it over the course of it. And it was the third general great power war in 50 years that started in 1756. And here was your starting lineup. Excuse me. On Britain's side, Prussia and Great Britain took on Austria, France, and Russia. These were the core combatants in Europe. And to show how these sorts of alliances shifted and changed, the last time that all of these great powers had gone to war had been about 10 years previously, in 1745. And at that time, Great Britain was supporting Austria against France and Prussia over the War of the Austrian Succession, the war that brought Maria Theresa to the throne. Wars were not fought for ideology at the time, they were fought for gain. And at the time, and the main context or theme going through these wars throughout the 1700s is that whatever side France was on, Britain was on the other one. France was the superpower. This is Louis XV, grandson of Louis XIV. France alone was about 3 times the population of Prussia and Great Britain in 1756. On paper, Prussia and Great Britain should have been absolutely swamped by the other great powers. But in the course of the war, France was always hampered by the fact that it had to concentrate its main armed forces in Europe. Because there was always an enemy like Prussia, and Frederick the Great, the one advantage he had through this war, because the main European context of the war was France and Russia and Austria wanting to stomp on Prussia for what Prussia had done to them over the previous war. The fact that he was surrounded by enemies, Frederick the Great was able to make it work for him, and he spent most of the war scurrying from one border to another, fending off invasions. If these 3 nations had managed to invade all at once, they might have actually won the war. Britain, on the other hand, all Britain had to do was give money to Prussia. They didn't have to invest a lot of troops in Europe. So what Britain did, which is what Britain did in all of these wars in this era, is cruise around the world and try and snap up France's colonies. Just one mention on King George II, who was the King of Britain at the time. He was also the last British reigning monarch to command an army in battle, the Battle of Dettingen during the previous war in 1743. He actually won it. No other reigning monarch of England has appeared on a battlefield since. In 1763, the war ended, and in Europe it was, to use the Latin term, status quo antebellum. No one gets anything, no one loses anything, which was actually a victory for Prussia, because Prussia had expected it several times to be completely stomped over by its enemies. The big loser was France, because it lost a whole lot of colonies to Great Britain. Here is how things worked itself out in the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Britain agreed to give back 3 islands in the Caribbean to the French. In return, the French had to let Britain keep several other islands that they had taken in the Caribbean, plus Quebec, plus Ile Royale, plus us, and also Florida, which Britain had taken from Spain, which was a latecomer into the war on the side of France. You read histories of the Peace of Paris, and there's a real theme going through that in France at the time, they thought, we got away all right with this, because we got to have half of our Caribbean islands back, and, well, Canada was probably sour anyway. We're spending more money in those colonies than they're returning to us, so good riddance to them. Let British keep them. And actually, a lot of people in Britain thought the same thing in 1763. We should have held out for more. We should have held out for the rest of the Caribbean islands. The man who negotiated the peace on behalf of Britain came home as much as a goat as a hero. George III The king of George II was the king by the time the peace was signed. He became king in 1760, and this is him around that time. And 1763 was a really good year for George III, because not only was the war ending, he also got married. Not to this woman. I put her in because it's a lovely slide, and because also Lady Sarah Lennox was the sister of Samuel Holland's patron, the Duke of Lennox. That's how highly connected Holland was. This was George III's first love. He decided not to marry her. Instead, he followed orders and married a German princess, Charlotte of Mecklenburg. And remarkably, for the time, they had a very happy marriage, except for the times when George was unfortunately insane. They were quite an unusual royal couple in that they genuinely liked each other, and George never bothered with a mistress, which, again, kind of set him aside in Europe at the time. This, though, is what he got to look at. This is a very current map at the time. He got to look at his new empire in North America. And for 10 years, we often overlook this because historians have a bad habit. We like to fast forward to the juicy bits, and wars are generally the juicy bits. So we always skip over the 1760s so we can get to the next juicy bit, which is the American Revolution. But in 1763, British North America started at Florida and went to the Arctic Ocean. This was all British North America, biggest empire in the world since the time of Rome. And there was a plan. And the plan is the plan that actually led directly to the survey of Prince Edward Island. And this was the plan. And it makes sense if you do this to this map. If you draw a line along the Ohio River Valley watershed to the southern boundaries of the Great Lakes along Lake Ontario. And this was the plan. Everything to the west of that boundary on the map, we're not going to touch. We're going to leave that to the natives. We're going to leave that to the fur trade, because that is by far the most important economic benefit coming out of North America. Also a concession at the time in the 1760s to the fact that the last battles in the 7 Years' War fought in North America were not fought between British troops and French troops or British troops and Spanish troops. They were fought between British troops and native tribes on the frontier and Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, Chief Pontiac's uprising. Great Britain knew in the 1760s that they can't blithely say we're just going to spread as far west as we want to. There's going to be significant pushback, as Chief Pontiac indicated, so they weren't even going to do that. We're going to draw a boundary, and we're going to settle in between. And here's what made the plan make sense. Between the theoretical boundary and the existing kind of frontier settlement, that wasn't actually where the British settlers were. There was thousands and millions of acres in between, a wilderness that hadn't been settled yet. So what Britain said, what they said in London is, we're not just going to let the existing colonies like Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania expand their borders westward until they meet our new boundary. We're going to cut them off where they are, and we're going to create new colonies. And we're going to settle them on a new plan. And that is, we're going to turn the colonies into large estates, grant those estates to qualified people, both in the colonies and in Great Britain. Essentially, we're going to create a landed gentry in North America. This is the guy who is going to be in charge of it, Wills Hill, Earl of Hillsboro. He was First Lord of the Lords Commissioner of Trade and Plantations. They're the body that's going to become the colonial office. And I love this portrait because it's such a contrast to a contemporary of his, John Percival, 2nd Earl of Egmont. And this guy gets ridiculed in island history. He's the one who wanted to turn the whole island into a feudal fiefdom for himself. John Stuart in 1805 said he wanted to be the Lord Paramount of Prince Edward Island. And the fact, just to compare this is a very old-fashioned portrait. It's done at the same time as Wills Hill, but he's looking like he belongs in a different century. Because I think he wanted to belong in a different century, and he was known for that at the time, as being quite an eccentric. This was his house. This is the house he built. He didn't inherit this. He built a medieval castle because he liked the look of it. He was also known at the time for thinking that what the British Army should do is turn the clock back a few centuries, and instead of having its troops equipped with firearms with the black powder brown besses, go back to the good old longbow. Just a little aside here, okay? No, wait on this. We're going to put him at one end of the end zone out at UPEI. We're going to put him in one end zone. We're going to put her, she's got a longbow. We're going to put her in the other end zone. We're going to let them each take a shot. Who are you putting your money on? 98 times out of 100, I guarantee. Because this is only accurate to about 50 yards out. This is accurate even with a heavy arrow designed to go through plate armor is pretty accurate to 100 yards. 100 yards with a light arrow, he's dead every time. The problem, the Egmont wasn't a lunatic for wanting to re-equip with bows and arrows. He just wasn't realistic because he takes a lot more training than he does. So you have to invest a lot more in an army of longbowmen than you do in an army of black powder soldiers. And besides, all the other armies will laugh at you, and armies hate being laughed at. So that never happened. He, though, was interested in this island, and I don't know where it came from. I suspect, and this is my speculation, this is not history written down, but I suspect his inspiration was this man, Thomas Pichon, and the book that he wrote in 1760. Thomas Pichon was a retired French spy. He had delivered Fort Beauséjour to the English in 1756, I think it was, 56 or 57. And having done that, having already turned his coat, he's not worthwhile as a spy anymore. He can't keep spying for the British. The French know who he is. So he moves to London, and by way of trying to make himself still current, still important, he writes Genuine History and Memoirs of Cape Breton and Ile Saint-Jean. The main point of his book was he was trying to emphasize, don't give Cape Breton back this time. That's what had happened in the 1740s. France, at the negotiating table, had been able to trade enough to get Louisbourg and Ile Royale back into their side. And what Pichon was saying, don't do that again. Louisbourg is actually a superior naval base to Halifax. Don't give Cape Breton back. And then because I'm positive, because he had the material. He had been the secretary to the French governor in the 1750s when there had been a survey of St. John's Island or Ile Saint-Jean. Because he had the notes, because he had the material, and because he wanted to fill more space, he added a section on Ile Saint-Jean. Just ripped straight from the report that he had ghosted for his governor back in 1752, saying, by the way, the other little colony that's there, fantastic agricultural land, don't give that one back either. I would so love to find an inventory of the Earl of Egmont's library to see if he actually had that book in the library, or even his library card to see if he borrowed it. Something got Egmont interested in St. John's Island, which is why he came up with the scheme that he did. And we laugh at it, but this was Egmont's scheme. Island to be divided into 50 equal parts, each called 100. He was assuming that there was 2 million acres on the island because it hadn't been surveyed yet. He's going to keep about a fifth of it for himself, grant the other 10 to major tenants. They're going to subdivide it into manors. The lords of the manor are going to subdivide it into hundreds. Here's the thing, though, that makes the plan tick. First of all, every 100 is responsible for furnishing, training, and equipping, and making sure they're ready to go to war 30 soldiers. Unfortunately, they're probably going to be going with those stupid brown besses instead of longbows, but we live with what we have to. The land would also be leased. The Crown gets something from this too. I forgot to mention, Great Britain won the war, the 7 Years' War, at a cost of the biggest national debt in its history to that point. They were mired in debt. That's another reason why they were so keen to end the war on reasonably favorable terms for the French in 1763. They had to start paying for it. This was Egmont's scheme to help them pay for it. There'd be split rent. Basically, the landlord gets a shilling, the Crown gets a shilling. And here's the extrapolation, because he wasn't just saying just Prince Edward Island or Ile Saint-Jean. We're going to do this and the rest of the new territories. He figured, again, on this is what I think is out there. We can make 62 18 million acre provinces. They'll generate close to £600,000 per year in revenue for the Crown. And more importantly, they're going to generate close to 750,000 soldiers for the army. That's why Egmont's scheme, I think, is so extra regimented, because it's a military scheme. He wants money, but he also wants not a standing army, but an army that's ready to go to war at an instant, just like they did in good old feudal days. Of course, that never happened, but it got the Colonial Office or the Lords Commissioner thinking there is an island that there's a lot of interest in, and there's a scheme that we have to come up with for ways to subdivide our new empire, so let's try it there. The third part going into this is Samuel Holland is a soldier without a war to fight in 1763. He's a military engineer. He's a surveyor. He's looking for a job. So he comes up with a very good plan, which is convince the Lords Commissioner that we've got all this new territory. You have to know what's there. You have to survey it. And he put together a very concise, very economical plan to, if you promote me as the Surveyor General for the Northern District, this is how we'll survey each and every bit of that new property so that you can dispose of it. And because of the interest in St. John's Island, we got to be the pilot project. This was his patron, and I'm sure that a lot of the fact that he got to do this was the fact that Charles Lennox was a guy that said, "Come and stay with me, Samuel, when you next time you're in London." Remember, he's the brother of the woman who was almost the Queen of England. He is not without clout, which is how we get Holland's map. And just to go back to Lord Egmont, not a whole lot, a substantial amount of difference, but islands surveyed into estates, not 40,000 acre estates, but 67, roughly 20,000 acre estates. The quint rents aspect is there, although Holland's plan ended up being more expensive for the landlords than Egmont's plan was going to be, with rent assessed on how Holland was assessing each individual lot. And as George will indicate as he comes up next, a lot of Holland's original assessment was, A, how much access to the fishery is there, because that was the major economic engine when this was a French colony, and how much presence had there been there when the French were here, because they've already cleared land. If the French had been on the lot before, it's more valuable than one where they'd never touched before, because that's a lot harder land to clear. I don't have my watch. I think I've used my 20 minutes. I'm going to sit down now.
Good evening, everybody. I'll start my presentation by reading you two excerpts from letters written by Samuel Holland in the fall of 1764. He arrived on the island in October, I believe, and in one of his letters to England, to London, he mentions, in a number of letters, of course, the situation of the Acadians on the island. In one of those letters, he says, there are about 30 French Acadian families on the island who are called prisoners and are kept on the same footing as those in Halifax. They are extremely poor and maintain themselves by their industry in gardening, fishing, fowling, etc. The few remaining houses in the different parts of the island are very bad. The quantity of cattle is but very inconsiderable. The timber is generally good. And the other excerpt is, he gets his information because he's at Rocky Point, but two of his men had gone as far as St. Peter's and maybe also Bay Fortune, and they came back and they gave him some information of what they had found there. He said, so they gave him a description of the Acadians they had seen. They hadn't seen all the Acadians that were on the island, as we will see, but he had probably met those that were still in Havre-Saint-Pierre, St. Peter's Harbor, and maybe also, as I said, in Bay Fortune. He says, these poor people were left on the island after the surrender of Louisbourg, when the other inhabitants were transported to France, as they lived in a distant place and in the woods, but surrendered themselves afterwards, and when indulged by some of the commanding officers of Fort Amherst to live on their fishery and gardening. Some of them have been to me to beg protection, as the present commanding officer lays claim to everything they have. The captain says they refused the oath of allegiance, but they told me they would do anything required and become good subjects here, or they would be glad to be transported to Canada. Now, you've heard in the first paragraph there are about 30 French Acadian families, and I'm sure you have heard that number many times because it's repeated in books, and usually what's written is that these Acadians are the ancestors of all the or most of the Acadians on the island today, and that they had hidden in the woods. Now, that's not totally true, but certainly Holland's men had probably talked with some of those people, and it was the case for a certain number of families. So until about 2 years ago, that was about the only information we had about the Acadians on the island when Holland arrived. We didn't have any names for them. We didn't know exactly where they were. Well, he mentions St. Peter's Harbor and also Bay Fortune. But 2 years ago, and you probably heard about that not that long ago, 2 years ago, that at least 1 or 2 documents were found, one in France and one in the United States, with a list, the names of the Acadians who were on the island, those who were here in 1763, and those, and also another list for 1765 that Earl Lucky found. Now I'm supposed to have, okay, there he is. That's Holland. So the first list was found by an American historian, Christopher Hodson. He teaches at Brigham Young University in Utah. And he was doing research on the Acadians who had settled in the Caribbean. And in the archives in France, he found this list of Acadians on the island. He didn't really know what it was. He sent it to the Acadian Studies Center in Moncton, and one historian there said, "Oh, that's the list we were looking for." So that list is very, very interesting for us, for people doing Acadian genealogy, because usually many census, they give the name of the head of the household, and then if he has a wife, if she's not a widow, and then how many kids, no other names. But this one gives the name, the maiden name of the wives. So it certainly helps historians and especially genealogists to identify them. So that was the first list, and I'll come back to it. And the second one was found by Earl Lucky, and it's a list that was drawn by Captain Williams, who was the man in charge at Fort Amherst, and it was drawn up or signed in December 1765. So a little bit, this one was done a bit earlier, in the summer of 1763, the other one in the December 1765. And Earl Lucky found that list the same year as the other one was found, but this one he found at the University of Michigan in the Thomas Gage papers. So, and that list is very interesting also. I'll mention a few things about it, but you only get the name of the head of the household. You don't get the names, head of households and men who were single, but who were in their 20s. It says if they're married or not, and the number of kids, of children in the family. So in the 1763 list, there are 37 households on the island. And the total population would be 197. Now, Holland said that when he arrived in the fall of 1764, there were about 30 families. Well, it's quite close, 37, and his men had not been to Rustico and a few other places where Acadians were at the time. Now, where were they located? You cannot really see it there, but that's where they were in 6 different places on the island. Rustico, they were in Tracadie. The biggest group was in Havre Saint-Pierre, St. Peter's Harbor. Baie de Fortune, Fortune Bay. Port-la-Joie, there was 3 families there. And the other ones were at Le Moulin à Vent. So in St. Peter's, 13 families. Baie Fortune, 4. Le Moulin à Vent, which would be at a place called Ellis area today, which is next to Mount Stewart, and 9 in Tracadie. And as you see, it's on the western side of the bay. And the Rustico 3, and surprisingly 3 at Port-la-Joie or Rocky Point. Some of those families probably had not left the island in 1758 when the population was expelled to France. It is possible that a few families who were in Bay Fortune and others who were in Tracadie remained on the island. Family names, Book, which are today Burke, those descendants on the island, Acadian Burkes. Pitt, especially the Peters from Eastern Kings. Boudreau, there's very few on the island with the name Boudreau are a descendant of that family, but that Boudreau family had 10 daughters. And in my family tree, I find 7 of those daughters, of those sisters. Chiasson, the Chastons from Rolla Bay, with probably their family remained on the island in 1758. There was a Cormier family, and maybe a Doucette family, maybe 1 or 2 Arsenault families too. But most of the Acadians that had not been deported had gone to the mainland, and some will come back in the years that follow. And most of those families that escaped the island went to refugee camps on the mainland, on the Miramichi River, and then to the Ristigouche River, across from Campbellton, New Brunswick. In my family tree, and I'm lucky to have all the branches done, I find at least 10 of the couples in that list, 1763 list. And the list also includes the families who were on the Madeline Islands. They had been brought there to hunt walruses, sea cows. And among those families there, I find 6 of my ancestors, because a lot of those who were on the Madeline Islands didn't stay there. A lot of them came back to the island, and some of them settled on Malpeque Bay. So in the spring of 1765, many of those families that were on the island decided to leave and move to French territory because they thought they would have help and maybe a place to settle. So they went to the French island of Miquelon, Saint-Pierre-Miquelon, near Newfoundland. And some stayed, others came back to the island, some were deported to France from there. It's a very complicated story, but it's important to know that many of the families who were here in 1763 and probably were still here when Holland arrived, they left the island probably in the summer of 1765 and went to Miquelon. So by December 1765, according to Captain Williams' list, there were now only 24 households on the island. There were 37 in 1763, now only 24, a population of 124 compared to 197. That's Acadian population. Where were these people in 1765? There were 16 homes or families in St. Peter's. There was 7 in Bay Fortune, and 1 listed at Trois-Rivières, Three Rivers, which would probably be near Montague, Lower Montague. But on that list, there's in that little section where it talks about Three Rivers, it says 64 to 70 Acadians that David Higgins brought here from the Madeline Islands. And we know that David Higgins was recruiting Acadians here and there to come and work for his fisheries. He was one of the first ones to be involved in the fisheries on the island after the British conquest. And he was working at Three Rivers. He was also he had also a fishery at Malpeque. So we know that he encouraged Acadians to come to work for them, and he told them that he'd find them a priest, and that's all documented. Now, okay, that's the Holland map. I was probably one of the few in the room here who have had the chance to touch it. A few years ago, I was in London visiting Doug Sobey, and we went to the Hughes archive, and we got the map out. He had seen it before, and so we had a chance to take photos of it and to look at it closely. So the map is a big one, 9 by 13 feet. which will be coming to the island. As you know, this summer there will be a major exhibit at the Confed Center. It's being restored right now. And so the question is, what do we learn from the map about the Acadians who had been on the island before deportation? Well, we know that in 1758, according to the most recent estimates that we have, the civil or the Acadian population on the island would have been around 4,250. Okay? Deported to France in the fall of 1758, about 3,100. It's believed that maybe 150 individuals remained on the island, only around 150, while about 1,100 escaped to the mainland. We know also that the population on the island had doubled, almost doubled, between 1752 and 1758. Many refugees were coming from the mainland, from Acadie, and when the deportation started in 1755 in Nova Scotia, around the Beauséjour, a few thousand Acadians came to the island as refugees because the island was still French territory. While Acadie, Acadia, Nova Scotia had been under the British flag since 1713. So, according to the 1752 census, we know who was where, and we get place names for the island. The 1752 census was done by Sieur de la Roque. It's a marvelous census. We get so many details, you know. For instance, I have a number of my ancestors in it, and you know where they were located, if they were on a certain river and which side, the name of how long they had been on the island, the maiden name of the housewife, her age, the name of all the children, their age, and then how many acres they had cleared, how many geese, ducks, pigs, cows, sheep they had, and what they had sowed that spring. So that's quite interesting. There are not too many census done on the island. I think it's the only one where you get so much detail. So using that census a few years ago, in 2008, I did some research, and with the help of a friend, Samuel Holland, who was a geography professor at the University of Moncton, we did a map of the island, locating all the areas that were listed in the 1752 census and where people were living. So you get a good idea of where the settlements were. Most of them were in the eastern half of the island. Very few. The further west was Malpec, 1752. You have a few around Bedec, Rivière des Blonds, this is Tryon, Crapaud, La Traverse, Cape Traverse. And then mainly on the Hillsboro River, the biggest community was in this area here, Havre Saint-Pierre, which was the oldest with a few others, but the main one. And then around the bay, Hillsboro Bay. And in 1752, there were nobody recorded between Pinette and there was nobody at Three Rivers, I don't think so, between Fortune Bay. So, but there will be some families, some individuals coming after 1752. So that's what we know of where the people were, how the places were named, and some of them those names have been preserved, others have completely disappeared. Now, on the Holland map, and because of it, we can know exactly where those people were settled. Because reading the 1752 census, they say, oh yes, they were there on that river or whatever, but we don't know where the concentrations were. So because of the map and because all the homes that were found standing in 1764-65, or most of them, are indicated on the map with a little block. We'll see it. Now this is the map. That's the Hillsboro River. Okay, so it gives you an idea of what the map looks like. Now this just, we'll see a few little details. This is in lot 13. It's the Malpeque settlement, or a part of it. This is what we call Low Point. And so you see, when you see little blocks like that, it indicates a house or a farm, probably a house and a few barns, whatever. But what is interesting here, you have, it's not very clear, but that represents the church that was still standing. And here you have a windmill. Okay? Now there are, and also you see here you have trees, but here it's cleared. So that when you see all these little points, that would be cleared land, probably. And maybe a part of it would be marshland. I think you see the marshland over here, like they're more like a bit pink, okay? And in fact, you've heard of the archeological digs that were done by Helen Christensen and her team over the last few years at Pointe-aux-Vieux. Believe that the house was just in this area. And if you want to know more about what was found there, there's this excellent exhibit which will be up at the Acadian Museum in Miscouche until, I believe, next fall. So if you haven't seen it, still have a chance to go and see this beautiful exhibit. Now, this is another excerpt from that map, and this is the Tracadie settlement. Now, where was this? Well, Dalvey would be here, and Corranban would be around here, okay? So the settlement was close to the water, and some of them were into cod fisheries. So in those days, they fished with sailboats. So you wouldn't go and have your boat at the head of the the head of the bay, because if you wanted to go out, you didn't want to take half a day just to go out to the Gulf. So the houses were quite close to the shore. So you see some of the houses there, and then you see a mill also, a windmill standing. You have also a few houses here near Corranban, and I think there's one or two on the other side of the bay. So that's a type of detail that you find on the Holland map. But also, we always talk about the map, but on the map, there's also this table with information about the lots. So it's hard to read, but it's all divided up in the sections. One is the number of the township, so township 12, 13, the quantity of acres, the boundaries and extent, so bounded on the north, bounded on the south, bounded on the east, and bounded on the west. The next one is quality of the lands and woods. This one is cleared lands and houses, and then remarks. I'll just give you one example so you'll get a sense of the importance of the information that is given on the map. Lot 13. Lot 13, that's where Malpeque settlement was, at Pointe-aux-Vieux. Cleared lands and houses. One church, 24 houses and barns. Cleared lands, 750 acres. Remarks. This is one of the best townships upon the island, as well for the situation for fishery as for the cleared lands and crossing the island at Enmore River, taking the Enmore River across Prince County. Now today that area would be where Green Park is, where the Yos had their shipbuilding industry. There's beautiful land there, and even before it was settled, we have descriptions of that area of the island saying that the best trees, the best wooded land on the island. Now, and this is a map that will be probably in the book that Earl Lucky and Doug Sobey have written on Samuel Holland and his work on the island and the study of the map. So Doug took examined all the little points on the map and all the descriptions left by Holland and placed on the map where the Acadian houses or the houses were located on the map. So it gives you a good idea of where the settlements were. So we know that the Malpeque settlement, most of it was on the west side of the bay, from Grand River up to on the other side of Green Park. You have a little group here at Lower Bedeque. And then, and he has a few names also, a few of the French names, not many on the map. Travers Village, Cape Travers, le village de la Traverse, because that's where the Micmac used to go to cross to New Brunswick, to the mainland. Then you have Tryon, Rivière-des-Blancs, Crapaud, and there's a concentration of communities around there. Okay, the Prim village, Pointe Prim, which is today Eldon, and then there's a Pinette village here. What else? So you get all that information, and Doug used what was found on the map, the points on the map, but also in those tables, because sometimes on the table it will say, oh, there are 15 abandoned houses, but then there's only maybe 10 on the map, so he calculated all of them. Now we'll come back to it. So here you see there are many settlements here, and you think there would be more houses on the Holland map than there's there. See? Oh no, let's go back here. You see, it doesn't show many houses over there, and the homes were mainly on the east side of the Hillsboro River. Okay. Because there was quite a settlement at Johnson's River and Glenfinnan River also, quite a few families there. And it's not, doesn't show there because they didn't find many houses. But what seems to have happened is that, according to Holland, many of the houses in the area not too far from Rocky Point were demolished for the planks, for the wood to build Fort Amherst and other houses. And also he states that people were coming from Nova Scotia and even New England to get the wood from the houses. Because you have to imagine that, sawing wood, if there was no mill around, was a lot of work. So it's not surprising that the houses were demolished so they could use the wood to build new ones. And in fact, the house that Holland built for himself when he arrived near Rocky Point was built using an old Acadian house, or planks or boards from that house. So that would be why on Holland's map you don't have that many houses. And Doug Sobey has studied the map in great details, and I've read the 2 chapters that he has written for the book dealing with the Acadians, and it's really something quite impressive that he has done. So make sure to buy the book when it comes out. I told him I'd do a little bit of publicity if he let me use his map. And to show you that that all this information is interesting, because nobody had really studied Holland's map before. Historians who have written about the French period on the island, like Harvey and then Andrew Hill Clark, they hadn't examined the map. And so when Andrew Hill Clark did a map showing where the Acadians were settled on the island in 1752, using the 1752 census, he or the people who did the work for him, he said, there's supposed to be a certain number around the bay of Malpeque Bay, and here they are. But you see here, they put houses on the east side, but there was no Acadians settled on the east side of Malpeque Bay before 1758. And of course, here it's not too bad. They knew, but they put a lot of houses on the west side of Hillsboro, while there was not that as many. So look at that, and again, what we find through Holland's map. Okay, let's stay there then. I'm almost finished. We know that Holland employed a few Acadians to help out during the work they were doing on the island. He hired at least 3 local Acadians as guides and another as a pilot. The guides are identified in some of his records. One is called Joseph Poirier, another one is Pierre Cormier, and there's Jean Galland. And if you saw Lenny Gallant's show last summer, he mentioned that one of his ancestors had been a guide for Holland. Well, I had given him that information because Earl Lucky had asked me to identify who were those people, that the names he had found. So I thought that Lenny would be interested. In fact, Lenny would be a direct descendant of this Jean Galland that was one of the guys that was employed for Holland's team. The name of the pilot, especially who went to the Madeline Islands with Haldeman to do some survey there for Holland, his name is given as Jacob Gallant. Now, Jacob is certainly Jacques, and the Jacques that would have been old enough with enough experience to be a pilot and have the age to do that would be Jacques Galland, one of the sons of the ancestor of all the Gallants on the island, Michel Haché Galland. So, and in my family tree, I'm a descendant of that pilot. In fact, Jacques' daughter, Madeleine, married Jean-Baptiste Arsenault, my direct ancestor, and that family was founded my home village of Abrams Village in 1812. So those who settled in Abrams Village, the first one were mainly that family, Madeleine and her husband Jean-Baptiste, and their children who are already married. Now, why was the village called Abrams Village, or the Village des Abrahams? Because Jean-Baptiste's father was le Petit Abraham Arsenault. So people were saying, oh, that's the village of the Abrahams. So that's why Abrams Village. That's how it came about. So, as a conclusion, as you see, there's much and much more than I'm telling you tonight that we can learn about the Acadians through Holland's correspondence, through his map. And that will be very much detailed in the book that will be coming out. Make sure to buy it and read it. And of course, with the lists that have been found, the 1763 and 1765 list, we're getting to get a better grasp of what was the situation on the island in the 1760s. Who were those Acadians? Did they stay here? Did they move out? And that's what I'm doing with Earl Lucky in this article that we're working on. So that should come out as an article in a year or two from now. So I'd like to thank Doug Sobey and Earl for the information they shared with me for this talk, and thanks very much for inviting me tonight. Thanks.
Well, I feel a little bit inadequate. I may be overdressed, but I wish I had a PowerPoint. So if you'll bear with me, I'm pointless tonight, or at least PowerPointless. At any rate, dealing in antique maps as I do, I'm looking mainly at, and we have, by the way, I have a few maps over here which I brought in, which we can look at afterward, and you can ask me some questions on. But most of the antique maps that are around us today, with the exception of the wonderful one that we're going to see in the exhibition at the Confederation Center a little bit later this year, but most of the maps that we see are printed maps. That is, they were made with a printing press, and they were either printed from wood blocks or copper or steel plates, copper and steel engravings, or perhaps later lithographs. and most of them were produced in Europe during the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th and 19th centuries. And they were the product of, for the most part, European exploration, but a good deal of speculation as well. Now, the history of printed maps, so far as they involve our island, probably begins about 450 years ago. Now, in 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed west from France, and his travels landed him here for a brief stop at Cap d'Orléans. Today we call it Kildare Cape, or Jacques Cartier Provincial Park. Now, just because a European explorer stopped on our island and made a record of it, the information did not immediately make its way onto a printed map. In 1561, an Italian mapmaker named Rosselli, he printed a map showing our region, the region of the Gulf, including Newfoundland. And he included a place on it called Ile Saint-Jean. Now, the place that he mentioned as Ile Saint-Jean is nowhere near where we are standing today. It's actually, he identified a little wee spot in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, pretty close to Newfoundland. And it didn't look very much like our island did either. By the 1580s, the European map makers seem to have been receiving some more reliable information, and a map entitled America by Giovanni Dania, was published in 1582, shows a crescent-shaped island near the middle of the Gulf. And then in 1584, the map that Boyd Beck and Edward MacDonald describe as the chart by the French cartographer Jacques Deveau, which they also say was one of the first maps to identify the island in the Gulf. But in actual fact, our island, while it appeared on some maps from the period, did not appear on all of them, because we have Champlain's map from 1613, his big map showing the east coast and down the St. Lawrence River. Didn't show us at all. We weren't even there. We weren't even on the map. So we were on some maps, but we weren't on other maps. In fact, it was not until 1624 that our island, and this is generally accepted, our island finally appeared on a map roughly in the place where it should be. And this is the William Alexander map. And once again, Alexander was involved in trying to, he had been granted a large chunk of North America, or what was known of North America at the time. And he put together a book where he was trying to attract potential settlement to his land, and it included a map. And this Alexander map is therefore, as I say, considered to be one of the most important maps in the history of Canadian or Prince Edward Island cartography, because it is the first map that shows our island more or less where it belongs in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Now, what did the island look like? Well, I've often called it an amoeba. That's about as close as it got to the actual outline of what the island looks like. But in 1630, a map maker in France by the name of Delet, apparently a descendant, plays golf now. It has the same last name. But that map is by far the most accurate map of the island, showing more or less the island in its proper place in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It's beginning to achieve some definition. It's beginning to look like our island, and what's more, it is identified as our island. And it is also important because Champlain likely used that map, the 1630 Delet, for his own map in 1632, his update of his map showing the east coast of Canada, including the St. Lawrence River. Mapping of the island began to improve with European settlement. The French settlers arrived in the island in 1720 or thereabouts, and the prospect of commerce and defense of commercial interests drove the need for better maps. In 1751, a respected military engineer, Colonel Franquet, arrived on our island from Louisbourg, and he produced some of the designs for fortifications, and he is also credited with producing probably the first navigational chart of Hillsboro Bay. After the French were defeated at Louisbourg, then the English came along, and there is, in 1758 then, the first printed map that is dedicated exclusively to our island. Now, this appeared in a magazine, a monthly magazine in London called the Grand Magazine of Magazines. Doesn't really roll off the tongue, but it was maybe catchy in its day. At any rate, we have an example of that here too, as well, but it's very tiny. And again, if I had a PowerPoint, next time I'll have a PowerPoint. But you'll see it is called the Map of the Island of St. John near Nova Scotia, lately taken from the French, 1758. And it is a small map, but as I say, noteworthy for the reason that it is the very first printed map showing just our island. But when you see it, you'll recognize how inaccurate it is. It's basically derived from earlier material produced by the French. So inaccurate that it has the far western corner or end of the island is actually another island. It's an island attached somehow to our island. I'm not suggesting in any way that they knew that up west was a long way away from the rest of the island, but it certainly appears that way when you see that map. And so as we've already heard this evening, that with the English taking over and Samuel Holland coming up with the idea that there should be some new mapping of all the British territory on the eastern seaboard. And we then eventually ended up with a new map of the island. He started with the island in large part because of its importance, the fishery, and with a crew of 40, he sailed from England on the Canso, a 200-ton vessel fitted out in England, and the party arrived on our island on October 5th, 1764. Holland had 4 principal assistants, including Thomas Wright, later to become a Surveyor General of the island. And also on board were Lieutenants Robinson, Haldeman, and Carleton. Now, their instructions were fairly clear. They were to undertake the survey with the greatest precision and exactness. The latitudes and longitudes of the most important places must be settled by just astronomical observation. The depths of water and soundings, as well as the coast with the harbors, must be taken with the greatest care, and every remark made which can tend to the security and information of such as His Majesty's subjects as may navigate those seas. And Holland was also given instruction to divide the island into 67 lots of about 20,000 acres each. Another artifact that we have here this evening that we can show you is the original deed for Lot 48, which is Stratford and Keppoch, and those areas as well. So we have the original deed with us tonight, and it's quite fascinating to see. It's on vellum, but again, we'll show you that a little bit later. On October the 4th, 1765, the island surveys had made such progress that Holland was able to send Lieutenant Robinson home to England with large and small manuscript maps of our island, along with some other maps of the region. And not long after Holland's maps arrived in England, printed maps with the new information began to appear. An early edition of the map by Rock carries a date of 1765, though that's probably inaccurate. It was probably a misunderstanding that it actually refers to the survey being completed in 1765. Perhaps, though, the first printed map to benefit from the survey work by Holland and his crew is the second state of the John Montresor map of Nova Scotia and Acadia. And it's a large wall map, almost, well, about half the size of the PowerPoint. It's notable in that the whole map looks really out of date, except Prince Edward Island. It jumps up, and again, if I had the PowerPoint, we'd see that. It jumps off the page because it is so accurate, and it does derive all of its importance to Holland and his crew and the survey that they completed. But now, likely the most common printed map of the last quarter of the 18th century is the one by Thomas Jeffreys. It's simply called a map of the island of St. John. We have examples here tonight. And it also includes an inset map of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, as well as the list of the original 67 lot holders. The map was published and sold by a London printing firm named Laurie and Whittle. It could be purchased as a single map, but it more commonly appeared in an atlas of North America. And when you get a chance to see the original examples, and well, actually to some extent even on this big, that's not scale, but you can see down in the middle, there seems to be some discoloration down the middle of the map in a vertical attitude there. Well, that's the original fold. And you'll see it also on the original maps that we have brought here tonight. It's the original fold where the map was folded into the atlas, which is another reason why antique maps have survived. Because for 200 or 300 or 400 years, they were inside books. They were protected by the covers. But in the last half century or so, the collecting of antique maps worldwide, but particularly in North America, has expanded considerably. And for better or worse, a lot of atlases, antique atlases, have been taken apart. And the individual maps, as I often say, have been liberated from their bindings and offered up for resale. And there's commercial reason for that. Many dealers, myself included, have discovered that the selling of the individual maps can generate more revenue than the cost of the atlas. So you buy the atlas, take it apart, sell off the individual maps, and realize the profit. The Holland survey led to printed maps not only in the United Kingdom but also in France. And notably, the one, and we have an example of it here tonight too, the one attributed to Sartine from 1777. And I'm just going to get it for a moment, though. What's interesting about the Sartine map is, I know that there'll be some reflection here. It'll be very difficult for you to see, but you can come down afterwards. It is, you can perhaps see it's very accurate because he's basically copied. They didn't really have copyright back in those days, so you could just copy things if you wanted to. And that's what the Sartine map is. It's basically a copy, but in some respects, it's the most attractive, aesthetically attractive map ever produced of Prince Edward Island in that day. There are so many little features that he includes which are strictly artistic. The arrangement of the island on the printed page is second to none, really. Where he employs a little bit of creativity, though, are these marks here, which are supposed to indicate points of elevation. and I know you can't see at the back, but the important thing is that all of these points of elevation are entirely bogus. And he kind of blows it a little bit, I think, when he puts the X in the middle. But the one thing about it that is worth noting is that in the cartouche, or the title here, he does give a reference, a credit to Captain Holland, the English Captain Holland. And so really for the next 80 years or so, the Holland map was the map that defined the island. And it really wasn't improved upon very much until Captain Bayfield arrived and began his work in 1840. And if I could just close now with a personal note, and that is, I think that I'm hard-pressed to think of any other individual in the history, with the possible exception of the Lieutenant Governor, who's had so much impact on our history. He provided us with the lots, which are still on the map today. He provided us with the counties, the parishes. We don't talk about those so much anymore, but also a great many place names. And barring some sort of radical regime change, all of that will be with the island forever. And so I don't think there's any way we can overstate the importance of Captain Holland. Thank you.